I'm investigative journalist Mollye Barrows. For years, I've covered the stories that made headlines in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf Coast. Murders, missing persons, and mysteries of all kinds. These cases are far from over for many victims because the full story has yet to surface. Join me for Gulf Coast Confidential, where I dive into the saltier side of the South and expose the lies, greed, and corruption that often weighs down the truth. It's time to turn the tide and get a shot at justice. Hi, I'm investigative journalist Mollye Barrows. I've been covering crime in Florida's Panhandle for a long time, and welcome to my series, Gulf Coast Confidential. From murders to mysteries, I explore some of the saltier stories that surface in Northwest Florida and all along the Gulf of Mexico. My co-host is Pam Hill, and she can relate to many of the cases I talk about on Gulf Coast Confidential. Pam's sister Sharon Adelot was murdered by her own son on Christmas Eve in 2013, and dealing with Sharon's death and the ongoing aftermath, Pam is now a grief and loneliness researcher as well as a pharmacist, so she brings a unique perspective. And Pam, welcome as always.
Thank you.
And as our regular listeners know, we sometimes cover national cases because they touch on important issues that affect all of us, no matter where you live. And this episode is called The Bad Nurse. It's one of those cases. We're talking about the case of Charles Charlie Cullen, one of the most prolific serial killers in America. He copped to 29 murders, but investigators believe that number of victims may actually be closer to 400. The movie The Good Nurse, you can find on Netflix, is based on a true crime book about the case, and it has the same name. The story mostly follows his co-worker, fellow nurse and friend Amy Loughran, who helped stop Cullen and actually put him behind bars. So first, let's talk about Charlie Cullen's crimes, Pam. And Charlie Cullen was no angel of death. Not all of his victims were dying. Some were actually recovering when he killed them. Some he targeted, others he murdered randomly. He worked at 9 different hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania over the course of 16 years until he was arrested in 2003. His method was poisoning patients through their IV bags, and he used 3 drugs primarily: insulin, digoxin, and sometimes lidocaine. All 3 are clear drugs that would not be seen in the IV bags, and he injected those drugs into the IV bags that were kept with hospital supplies and injected them at the top of the bag, so when a nurse took one of those bags to give to a patient, it wouldn't leak, and the victims became random. He also injected the drugs directly into the IV bags of patients who were already connected to an IV. So Pam, you're a pharmacist and you understand these drugs better than I do. It seemed insulin was really his preferred drug of choice. Why was it so lethal to patients?
Well, because he would give a huge dose of it. Insulin is a wonderful drug to maintain blood sugars and to help our bodies function properly. But when you give too much, then people trend down sort of like coma. We know people that are diabetics that they know when their blood sugar gets low that they kind of are in a lethargic state. And these are people that are in the hospital hooked up to an IV. And like you said, most of them were not dying or imminent. Most of them were in recovery. They were recovering. And so this is a very interesting case to me because a lot of times, now, let's just say this right off the bat, nurses are some of my favorite people in the world. You have to be a very special person to be a nurse. My mom was a nurse, my aunt, a lot of my friends are nurses. I personally don't think I'm a good enough person to be a nurse because you have to be super duper special.
It is a special calling.
Yes.
My mom's in a nursing home. She's been in and out of hospitals for some time now. She's elderly, so I know what you mean.
Right.
I work with them on a regular basis as they take care of my mom, and it is a special calling. They're fixers. They're generous people. They're good-hearted and good-spirited.
Right. And this case took place in 1988 to 2003. And now, finally, nurses, they finally are being paid what they should have been paid, the respect, and things have trended in a different way. But we have to put ourselves back in this time. A lot of nurses are in the room by themselves and giving care, patient care, hygiene, along with medications and things like that. So there's a lot of autonomy. But nurses, they stay pretty much doing their thing in their lane. But they said that Charlie, he had a great interest in everybody else's patients too.
I know, and it's interesting because that time period, he's accused again of just heinous murders over a 16-year period, 9 different hospitals, but the time period was basically 1988 to 2003 when they finally caught up with them. And that's the time period that the story focuses on in the Good Nurse. It's 2003. It's those final months that he was working at a hospital in New Jersey when he met Amy Loughran, and they became friends, and he was finally caught. And it was just fascinating, I thought, when they opened up the show, essentially the movie, when they talked about the elderly patient that he was caring for. It was actually Amy's patient. And then he steps in not long after working there. And I thought it was a great shot. It was from the outside of the hall looking into the room when the elderly patient, who was expected to be okay, codes, and you just see her feet kicking, and you see him go in there and respond, but you don't see him, which you presume he's at the head of the bed where you can't see. And then he steps back where you can see him in the shot at the foot of the bed, and the medical team rushes in to try to save her, and he's just standing there watching the legs kick. The team, you assume, is in there attending to her, but he's just watching it all. And that's what's so insidious about all this. You're never more vulnerable than when you're laying in a hospital bed, and there's nothing you can do. You're relying on these strangers essentially to give you life-saving care, and in this case, he was giving them deadly care.
Right. Well, and also that shot was very interesting to me too, because when the lady started to code, he just kind of backed off. Most nurses or healthcare professionals are going to jump right in and be asking for help and getting things going. But he just kind of stepped back and took it all in like a movie, which I didn't know how the story was going to go at first, but that disturbed me. I thought, he's not a good nurse. He's just watching.
Yes.
Why? Maybe he's not that smart. Maybe he's not good in a crisis, whatever, but he certainly doesn't need to be the nurse.
Right. And that's what's so fascinating, I guess, partially why he got away with it for so long. And we'll get into some of the other reasons why he got away with it for so long. And part of it was he was enabled by the very corrupt corporate healthcare system that would put people's profits over, or their profits over people's lives, and so they would pass him around from hospital to hospital essentially, so they wouldn't have to pay lawsuits in case people realized what was happening. But going back to the drugs that he was using, the insulin would drip in the IV bag. So it's not like you poison it, even if it wasn't one of his patients, or it was one of his patients, and you were going to go back and look in the system as to, who was treating that patient. If he was killing other nurses' patients and they were being poisoned slowly through that slow drip of an IV bag, it wouldn't necessarily go back to him immediately.
Right. No, and they didn't have like we have now, which are these adverse events, and what they call adverse events are when something like that happens. Or in our state, Florida, for pharmacy, we have something called CQI, which is continuous quality improvement. We have to meet every so often when there are a near miss, or you realize, whoa, I might have got that look-alike, sound-alike drug there. Let's have a meeting. I mean, now it is so different, and it takes the whole unit, the whole team, pharmacists, doctors, nurses, administration, everybody together. But back then, they had such a shortage, and they were sort of separate. There was administration and there was nursing care or care. And all they cared about was profit, the hospitals, and mitigating any kind of lawsuits. But with these drugs, the insulin, all of it, if it was in the IV, would be over a slow drip. But he liked to use digoxin.
And what is that?
All right. Digoxin is a drug that regulates the strength that your heart beats, just to keep it simple, to give you a good squeeze of your heart every time. But you don't need too much. If you have too much, your heart is overworking, and it's just like overworking a pump. Also, he used epinephrine. Epinephrine's something we use in a crisis, when somebody's coding or going bad. Sometimes we give them epinephrine to shock their system, just kind of keeping it simple here. And then sometimes lidocaine. It kind of numbs things. He just picked things, and he loved to go through the little Pyxis unit. He knew how to hijack that. That was the unit that distributed the medicine or held it or what have you.
The software system that the hospital used?
Right, and the actual hardware of drawers that would open and stuff. He would sometimes punch something in and then have the drawer open and then cancel it but he would reach in there and snatch that drug out real fast.
Right. He found the flaw in the system
Right.
that enabled him to do that.
Right. And these are maintenance drugs per se. They're not. It's not like he's grabbing OxyContin or fentanyl or something like that out of there. So they're probably like, no harm, no foul. But if they had like what we have now, where someone's going, why is this drawer opening 25 times on a shift? And you go ask people, why is this happening? That's just like in the pharmacy. People wonder, why does it take so long to fill a prescription? Well, it really doesn't when you think about everything. You have to have people that enter data, people that count medications, people that verify the medications, and it all has to go together, even the people that accept your prescription and present it to you. So you're checked about 5 times in retail pharmacy, which is what I do. I've only worked hospital pharmacy a little bit, and I realized that wasn't for me. It was too slow for me. But there's a method to it.
So I noticed some of the things that you brought with you today, and 2 of those are syringes. And if you could hand me one, it'd just be great to show people, because I thought one of the things that was interesting about that too, especially when the nurse in the movie The Good Nurse, Amy Loughran, catches on that perhaps something's going wrong. Police bring it to her attention. And you take a look at this syringe, and for those that are watching on YouTube, you can see it, but for those who are listening, we've all sadly seen needles, good, bad, or otherwise. They're part of the medical care system, but teeny tiny. I mean, occasionally when I sew a button, needles are bigger than the tip of this thing. So it's just unbelievably insidious to me, the way that he would inject it randomly into these IV bags. They showed the shot in the show of basically the hospital supply room. There's a bin of these IV bags that are ready to go, so nurses can go and grab one. And he would take a syringe like this and he would poke it in the top of the bag, so that when you pick it up, it doesn't necessarily leak right away, and you wouldn't realize that you've picked up a bag that's flawed or has a leak in it or a poke in it. But when she realized that perhaps that's what he was doing, and she went digging through the bags of IVs, and then she turned one upside down and saw it leak with that drip, and you just see the horror on her face and this look of realization that it is true. But I just wanted to show that, because it's just it's a level of planning, deliberation, certainly goes to motive, and to what you were saying, his enjoyment of it.
It's diabolical, because he could hold those syringes down beside him, or if they're capped, put them in his pocket. He did a lot of planning and a lot of sneakiness. And sometimes when someone's overly helpful, he loved being in the hospital because he was near his drug of choice and his victims of choice. Somebody laying supine on their back, hooked up to an IV, trying to get better, with maybe some family in there, maybe not. It looked like he tried to go when there weren't family members in there. And always getting in other people's business. I can stand beside another pharmacist for a 10-hour shift and maybe not know what they're doing unless there's an event, or unless there's some deep discussion, or unless they ask for my help. Because we typically stay in our lane, because I want my nurse or pharmacist or doctor or whomever concentrating on me. But they said he had all the extra, what are you doing, what are you doing? He had the most terrible charting, making obliterations and stuff, just to create more chaos. It's a system that lent itself to that. And as far as like hanging IV bags, he said, oh, I'll go hang that for you, because he knew how to hold it. I mean, you have to have some degree of, what are they doing?
Yes. Manipulation, really, I think, is what you're describing, and how he was able to hide behind being helpful. And I think they did a beautiful job of demonstrating that. I'm sure it was in the book. I didn't read it, unfortunately, but I have that on my to-do list. But it's what The Good Nurse was based on, the Netflix movie, and watching them show just how much he helped her. So The Good Nurse, being Amy Loughran, I think genuinely kind-hearted individual, like the nurses that we talked about earlier, just the very nature of nurses who really are in it for the right reasons, not homicidal maniacs like Charlie Cullen. Right. But Amy Loughran needed the help. Nursing, I think they did a great job of showing just how physical a job it is. She had heart trouble and was concerned about keeping her job. Her health insurance hadn't kicked in yet. She was a single mom raising her daughters on her own, and she needed the job. She needed the health care. So she was putting her very health at risk just by keeping the job and not taking time off because her health insurance hadn't kicked in. And then she had to move a patient, either a heavy person, could be a male, could be a female, but she was putting her life at risk just by being so physical, aside from just doing her job and checking medications and attending to her patients. And in other ways that aren't physical, there's just that physical aspect of it that was taking a toll on her. And it was also her kind heart. I feel like that there were two reasons that's why she and Charlie became close, and ultimately why he confessed to her, is that she was genuinely kind. She did not treat him any differently despite his odd, quiet behavior that perhaps kept him at arm's length from other people that might work with him. He had been to 9 different hospitals. People did know that he went from hospital to hospital. At any rate, I just thought that he capitalized on her need for help, but whereas it might have been manipulative in other situations, with her, he developed a friendship because she was so genuinely kind.
Right. And like you said, she had a heart problem, and she had to have that insurance, and she needed help. She had little kids.
And he was helping her hide
right.
that from the hospital,
Right.
that she had that health condition.
Right. And he even went to the Pyxis and stole some Cardiazem for her, too, when she was having an episode, because you would see her get emotional when a patient had passed away, and it was physical and emotional, and she would get in some sort of storm where she was having heart problems. And he picked the drug of choice. I have to give him credit. He picked a very good one. He picked her Cardiazem, and that helped her get through that episode and helped her heart keep beating and everything. So he was smart. They said he was a genius at medications, that he studied them all the time. And so I guess he was planning on doing bigger and better things eventually. But if someone's keeping a secret, there seems to be some sort of secret keeping you'll do for them too. So I think that had he not been keeping her secret, she might have spoke earlier, because they had 7 or 8 nurses at one of these hospitals that told administration, you get rid of him or else we are quitting en masse, all of us. And so they did. They moved him on down the road like they always did. They just keep moving him. And you have to keep in mind, too, during this time, male nurses were not as prevalent as they are now. And I think about this a lot, too. A lot of times male nurses were used because they could help lift.
They could do the heavy lifting.
And that's not fair to them, but that is how that was during that time.
Right. Well, and they portrayed it, the good nurse, Amy, not realizing that there was anything wrong, not picking up on any suspicious behavior necessarily, until the police approached her, until they started asking questions about the death of that first woman, the elderly patient that came in with just an allergic reaction to a drug, and she was on her way to getting better when he killed her, and she was, that was the one that when we get to it, we'll talk about how the hospital administration at this particular hospital, which was indicative of how every hospital administration that he worked for handled the just skyrocketing number of codes and cases where people died in his care or around him or during his shift. But when they did finally report that elderly woman's death to police, it was 2 to 3 months after she passed. And police were like, why so long? But that was when they started asking Amy about it, because that had been her patient. And she was initially defensive of him. So I don't know that she necessarily was trying to cover for him. I think what she did realize through her own experience. But to your point, she was very defensive of him. And I think it was because he was helping her. And she didn't want to believe it because she'd also allowed him to have access to her kids. So who wants to believe that you didn't have, that somebody got past your guard, if you will.
Right. Because that is when I think she saw the big exclamation point and went, oh my gosh, he's got to get out of my life.
And when she found the hole puncture, the pinprick, if you will, the leaking IV bag, she knew that that's how he was doing it. And she saw him obtain that drug that you mentioned that she needed for her heart condition. And she watched him utilize that flaw in the software system that allowed that drawer to open, him to cancel at the last minute, get the drug and close it, and it not necessarily be registered to him or not registered that he took it out. But it does bring the question up, who is Charlie Cullen? And I read up on him a little bit. I did not do near the research that obviously the folks that wrote the book or did the movie did, but he's from New Jersey. He's 63 now, serving a life sentence, but he was from a large Catholic family. I think one of 8 kids. Dad was a bus driver, died when he was a baby, and then his mother later died when he was 17 in a car accident. His sister was driving. And according to some folks, he described having a very unhappy childhood, multiple suicide attempts in all sorts of different ways, eventually dropped out of school, joined the Navy, and then the Navy discharged him as well for, again, suicide attempts.
Yeah,
so this is an unhappy individual.
Yeah, he tried it when he was like 9 years old also with his chemistry set.
Right, that was interesting. Back to the chemicals again.
Yeah, he knew that. And I mean, he's my age. So when we were that age, like 9 or 10 or whatever, we could make creepy crawlers and things and even make these little gummy things and eat them and little chemistry sets and stuff I don't necessarily see a lot of now. But he tried to poison himself with that but it wasn't strong enough. And that was his first attempt. Then maybe a year or so later, he didn't like his sister's boyfriend, so he tried to poison him.
Well, it's interesting. At what point did he turn from trying to kill himself to trying to kill others?
Right. I just think they said he liked new stuff, new things. That's why he liked learning so much. And he was socially stunted, emotionally stunted. So creating some sort of scene or event or fracas is the way he got that excitement junkie rush that he liked so much.
Interesting. And I thought it was revealing too, and they don't get into it too much in the telling of the story on The Good Nurse, but they do mention that he was divorced. He initially tells Amy he married a crazy lady. She's trying to keep him from the kids, and he would paint her, as so many people do, as just this unreasonable ex who had no reason for the things that she was saying. But he implied that, she accused him of poisoning the dog. And then when you read up on what their relationship was like, there was multiple accusations of domestic violence against him. There were multiple pets that she accused him of abusing.
Because he did. He tried to poison the pets too, even the neighbors' pets and stuff. And like Benadryl, that's what he'd give his kids at night. He was excited to be a father, but like everything else, the excitement waned. He got tired of it. And when he was done with you, he was done with you. Right. And so his wife, the crazy ex as he would call her, she took issue with him giving the children Benadryl every night, whether they needed it or not. And he just basically, when he was done with somebody, he's like, be done. I'm moving on. So he couldn't maintain a relationship with her because she wanted to do normal things like get a house, have a family, things like that.
Don't poison the pets.
Don't poison the pets or the children. So he wanted new stuff and be gone with the old stuff.
That's crazy, though. It seemed like the red flags were there when hindsight's 2020, but it's hard to know at the time that you're married to a homicidal maniac.
Yeah. Well, how do you know this is weirdo stuff? But people do some weirdo stuff, and if you're going to give kids, I've seen people give Benadryl to their children because they want them to rest or sleep, but that's not what you're supposed to do.
Right. It's not good for the child. It's not good for their bodies.
Right.
Certainly just it's indicative of self-centeredness, to say the least. And in his case, it was indicative of something a lot more. But yeah, they said he started killing in 1988. Wow. And again, it was a lethal overdose of intravenous medication to the first patient that he killed. And he later admitted to killing 11 patients at that hospital. It was called St. Barnabas Medical Center in New Jersey. He quit in 1992, and this will come as no surprise when authorities began investigating other tampering with intravenous fluid bags incidents or IV bags. He was allowed to move on, no problems, no questions, good references, if you will. And it continued a pattern across 9 different hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania until it all caught up with him at one of the last places that he worked, Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey. And that's where he met Amy Loughran, the nurse who was the good nurse.
The good nurse.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Amy. And we did mention, she had health trouble. She was a single mom. Charlie sort of helped her in ways that she needed. And it never occurred to her that he was anything other than just a helpful, good-hearted nurse like her other coworkers until police brought it to her attention. But I thought that without that friendship, I don't think he ever would have confessed. She was a single mother. I think, to your point, like, she was also new. Right. It was a new relationship. She was kind. She treated him like he was normal, even though he knew in his heart he certainly wasn't normal.
Well, he's on his 8th, 9th time there. It has to be exhausting after a while, and you have to know, especially if you're semi-brilliant like he was, you have to know it's going to catch up with you. So I think he was just enjoying the newness of the friendship. She enjoyed the camaraderie or the collegiality because he did present as a good nurse too. And so I think that's what was going on with her. But I think that we don't know how to think like people that come up with this diabolical stuff.
It's true.
Sometimes I think about that and go, how could we have protected ourselves? And I think, praise God, we don't think like that. Because can you imagine that being your mindset and what you think about all the time?
I know, it's true. And when you mentioned that, it brought to mind a case that I covered years ago. And I won't get too deep into it because it's actually probably worth an episode in and of itself. But one of my missing persons cases that I've covered for years here along the Gulf Coast, her name was Melissa Eck, Missy Eck, they called her. The last time she was seen alive was at her brother's house. And she went walking to a friend's house, never got there. Her body was later found in the woods. To this day, it remains unsolved. But I remember when I had a series called Cold Case Files, that one came up. And the sheriff's office, I worked with them regularly, Escambia Sheriff's Office, to cover and highlight a lot of these cases. I relied on them for the reports, the information, the interview with the investigator. And always I tried to interview a family member because that lets people know that this loss impacted in a very real way this family. And it puts a face and some heart to the story. So in this particular case, this family member of Melissa Eck, one of the family members worked for the sheriff's office. So the sheriff's office set up this interview for me to talk to her. I believe she was an aunt. And then also talked to another family member as well as her brother, one of the last people to see her alive there at the sheriff's office. So, you know, when you're putting together a story as a broadcast journalist, you want succinct sound bites. You know what I'm saying?
Right, yeah.
Like, otherwise you don't have time to include in a 3-minute piece. If you're lucky, you get 3 minutes.
Right.
A lot of times it's a minute and a half. So you're looking for 5, 10, 15, 20-second sound bites at the most. The aunt and the other relative did great. I could hardly pull any sound bites out of this guy. He was quiet, and he would just speak in just a few words at a time. And I kept thinking, gosh, is he stupid? Is he slow?
Yeah.
Is there some sort of disability there? And but I worked hard to get some sort of a soundbite from him because he had taken the time to be there. I tried to be inclusive, and I did manage to pull a couple sound bites from him, and I put this story together. Well, fast forward several years later, this brother is arrested in Louisiana for attacking a woman in a very sadistic way. He gets a long sentence in Louisiana. And I remember that we interviewed him for the story back in the Unsolved on Missy Eck. And so I pulled that segment because you don't save the raw video because those back in the day, those were beta tapes and you just use them again. But I did pull the finished product because those are archived, and I pulled his soundbite. And it was something innocuous. It was terrible what happened to my sister. I'm super sorry. But again, very unexpressive, very flat, not a lot of emotion from this guy. You wouldn't notice him if you were in the supermarket. You wouldn't notice him anywhere because he was unobtrusive. He was low key. He spoke quietly, almost to the point, like I said, I thought he was disabled or there were some mental problems. At any rate, so when I air this story and talk about how he was busted because we have this video of him, Florida Department of Law Enforcement agencies contacted the station and they wanted to see if we had the raw of him, because I brought it up that he was one of the last people to see his sister alive. And in like a lot of cases, investigators do have their prime suspect. They do have their person of interest. They do have that person that they think did it, but they just don't have the evidence to really show it. And I think maybe this was one of those cases. I don't know, but I'd like to dig into it a little bit more. But I remember I would go back and I thought about that interview a lot. And I almost felt like, and I don't know why, it's not my responsibility, but I felt like, why didn't I know he was capable of that? Why didn't he put off some sort of a signal? Why didn't I pick it up? You know, does his family, did they ever wonder and know, you know? And so when you talk about Charlie Cullen, it reminded me of him in that way.
Oh, wow.
The low-key guy that sits in the background, who maybe is the orchestrator of chaos that's happening all around, but he seems to be unaffected by it, and it's because he's the originator of it.
Right. They seem unaffected, but inside they're having a big old time. That's why I got this celebration stuff here. They celebrate that. They have a good old time. They feel like they did the right thing. We talk on this show so much, and it makes me madder than a hornet every time about how people that do this crazy stuff, this crazy stuff, how they giggle and laugh about it and say, I did the right thing or I'm helping humanity. I'm so tired of that. And I think that when people are inappropriate, we need to take notice of it. And especially like when our work situation, sometimes everybody just keeps their head down and just does the deal, just trying to get things done. But when you're in the healing professions, and we're learning so much as we go along, just this period of time, it's the same time I've been practicing pharmacy, the same time that this happened with him. So almost 40 years, I've seen pharmacy and I've seen medicine change from where we're like, here's your physical needs, let me take care of them. And almost like a waitress for nurses back in the day, how people treated them, to now they are treated, hopefully, and not everybody does this, but we're evolving. Same thing with pharmacy. As the healthcare professionals that we are and the people that we can help, your health care, this is the most important thing, your physical body. I can't think of anything more important except your soul, you know. So we are trusted servants, and we are to first not hurt anybody. If we can't help you, stop.
Right. And that it really is a perfect segue into the other issues that the good nurse brings out. And that is partially what enabled Charlie Cullen to continue killing without any consequences for so long, was because the hospital administrators passed the buck. They recognized something was wrong. There might have been some suspicions. In some cases, maybe they had proof, but they didn't want to admit it because they didn't want to open themselves up to the liability of lawsuits.
Well, that makes me madder than anything.
It's horrible. But it's corporate America.
It is, but and it's going to keep going that way. And then here's my question: how far do we keep going? We can only go so far till we hit rock bottom, to where people don't matter at all, where everything's just a transaction instead of a relationship, where everything, the currency is the almighty dollar. You can even look in my profession, in pharmacy. A lot of the big corporations are having to close stores and stuff because we have to care about people. And if you have to pay pharmacists and nurses and doctors more, do it. Don't balance everything on their back. In hospitals, a lot of people will say, certain hospitals, let's just say one around here, people loved it when the nuns ran it. And that's their feeling. Whether that's right, wrong, or indifferent, it's how they felt. But we can mitigate, here we are with these other things we talk about, mitigate things all day long. When you are in administration and you know a nurse killed one patient and you know it, they know it, a lot of them knew it, and you do not do something about it, I say you're as complicit as the person that killed them.
Yes.
And there were 29 of them that he copped to, and they said a whole lot more. But the thing is, they sent in risk management people when police would come around and talk to nurses to intimidate the nurses. And they had to pay some sort of price for telling the truth, and that resulted in they didn't speak freely.
Right. And I thought that they did a great job of revealing that and how that process worked in The Good Nurse when they started investigating the elderly woman's death. And that was when they brought Amy Loughran in, and she started talking about that. And the at-risk management person for the hospital, who was also a nurse, insisted on being there when police were interviewing her, insisted on being there when police were interviewing anyone. And it was when she walked out of the room and police had a moment with her alone. And they said, take a look at these charts. Do you see anything inconsistent? And she immediately saw some things and recognized that the at-risk management person, the woman who was also a nurse, also recognized.
Right. So Mary Land.
Exactly.
That's her name.
She began to the if you will, the dominoes began to fall, and she saw what was really happening.
Right. And she knew. She's the person I'm the most disenchanted with about the whole story. And actually, I'm so mad at her, and I think she should go on trial because they just kept passing the buck, and she kept the truth from coming out. She's the one that minimized and dehumanized every patient that was murdered.
And I think it's indicative of the system of each of those hospitals and probably ones that we don't even know about. But I do think that's one of the things that this case brought out, just highlighted with a white-hot spotlight, is that if corporate America is corrupt, no more can we see it any worse of a situation than with healthcare.
Right.
When, to your point, their first mandate is to do no harm.
Right, exactly.
And it doesn't say do no harm unless it hits your pocketbook.
Right.
Do no harm unless you're going to get sued. Do no harm unless you just don't want to.
Right, exactly.
I mean, get out of the business.
Right.
But I do think, and this is probably worth a whole nother segment, but I think insurance companies bear a lot of the blame. Until we get out of the for-profit insurance business, it's just going to continue to compound.
Well, we need to talk
like
about that one day, too, because they are acting like they're the doctor or the nurse or the pharmacist or whatever, and they are trying to run people's life. They may have a degree in business, but you shouldn't get to decide what the doctor is going to do with all these prior authorizations and things like that. If the doctor gives you a prescription, I figure that's your prior authorization.
Right.
And that's how simple I am. A simple old girl from Alabama.
Right. It goes to that old saying, you can kill more people with a briefcase than you can with a gun.
Oh, for real? I never heard that, but you can.
Yes.
But, I mean, my thing is, and the thing that upsets me, it just keeps going like that, like a runaway cart.
No accountability in the case of Charlie Cullen for any of the hospitals or administrations where anybody else died.
Yeah.
And again, as many as 400 people.
Right.
But it is interesting. I mean, I'm actually doing a series of stories about shootings that happen at lower income apartment complexes that are owned by out-of-state corporations. That basically they're management companies, they're investment companies. They go and buy these properties that not only do they collect the rent checks, they also collect the federally subsidized money that comes along with HUD. And so in response, because they're not always in town, there's maintenance issues that go unaddressed, and there's violence because it's no surprise that in a lot of these places there's high crime, there's a lot of drug dealing, people get killed that are involved in some of these crimes, and a lot of times they're just innocent bystanders. So there is this proliferation of lawsuits that are happening against these companies that own these apartment complexes for not providing better security, for not fixing gates that don't lock, for not, monitoring, hiring off-duty policemen to be guards, for not monitoring cameras. So that is one of the things, and I know personal injury attorneys, especially those who file lawsuits, get a bad rap. But from my experience and what I've seen, especially working at one point for a personal injury law firm, in America, where the dollar rules, if you don't have personal injury attorneys, whether their motivation is true justice or not, or just getting a lawsuit, and getting money from that, without that option, the average person wouldn't be able to find justice. They wouldn't be able to get, retribution, if you will. They wouldn't be able to find the truth of a situation and realize that it's not just their problem. It was the whole system that failed. That there could have been steps that were taken to protect these people that were shot. There could have been steps that were taken to protect these patients that died at the hand of Charlie Cullen if just one person had done their job and not made money the priority.
Or do the right thing, and that's what I'm saying. We are not getting any better about this.
So it may have to be more lawsuits.
Yeah,
really.
it may. Well, and that's why that's what they were afraid of, was lawsuits. So regular people, and this happened in this case too. One lady, she said, that weird nurse gave me a shot. And then one man was standing there and he said, I think I just witnessed them murder my mom. So these people kept on, but it's just like me with the case with my sister, always asking for people to do the next right thing, which they're not. A lot of people don't. I'm going to pursue justice for Sharon until I die. I already know that. I've had to power up for that for the rest of my life. Because if once you get in the judicial system, you see it's a big old dinosaur. It serves the people that work in it, payday and quitting time for a lot of them, not all of them.
A business.
Yeah, it's a business, but just like this with the hospitals. So somebody has to do the next right thing. And we can't put them out there and tar and feather them because they're doing the right thing. But that's where these risk management type things, they should not be without someone checking them. And that is why we do need attorneys to say, not so fast.
Right. Here's what's happening. Here's where the process failed. Here's where the system failed. Here's what could have been done. They knew exactly what was happening. You weren't hurt necessarily in a vacuum.
Right.
You were injured. And I'm not saying it's always that black and white, but to a great extent, there are things that could have been done to help if people were doing the right things and put that, prioritize that over hurting people or putting over money.
When's it enough? Because basically, even all the corporations and stuff, you got the fat cats, the stockholders and stuff. I mean, let's try to make money on something else. Let's do it on something inanimate instead of people. Let's don't do it at people in the hospital, because how much return on your investment do you need? Someone's life is incalculable.
Exactly.
I can't even say that word, but you can't put a price on that.
That's right. It's priceless. Well, I think that it starts to wrap it up for us on this segment. But what are some of your takeaways from The Good Nurse, and in our segment, The Bad Nurse?
Right. Some of my takeaways are that it's good to have someone in the hospital with you. It's good to ask the nurses. Nurses don't mind if you say, "What is that you're giving me?" They don't mind that. For us as contemporaries or other nurses and healthcare professionals, you have to be aware of what's going on around you. If you think something's wrong, check into it.
Yes. And for me, one of the takeaways was just how kind Amy Loughran was, and it was her kindness that essentially elicited a confession from Charlie Cullen. Because even though police knew that they had their man, they had arrested him, they had him in custody trying to elicit a confession. Without a confession, they really didn't have enough to hold him. And it was because of her friendship with him, because he trusted her, because she was kind to him, that she basically got him to confess. He said, yes, I did do it. He never told her why. But if he hadn't confessed to her, the hospital sure weren't going to hold him accountable. The police didn't have the evidence they needed to hold him accountable because the hospitals were being tight-lipped, because they were basically on his side, because it benefited them to be on his side.
Oh, Jeff.
He would have been out. He would have continued to kill. But she did the right thing. And I think that's partially why I think it was such a great title, The Good Nurse, because she was the good nurse on so many levels.
Right.
Not just a good nurse to her everyday patients. She was a good nurse when the whole system was breaking down.
Right.
She was the good nurse who was trying to do the right thing. She was the good nurse that held her homicidal nurse friend accountable.
And I think most nurses are good nurses. And I
Yes,
would say probably
absolutely.
most all of them. But his thing to her was, nobody stopped me.
That's right. That's exactly right. I mean, he might as well have just stood there pointing the finger at the hospitals, and the hospitals are like, yeah, well, whatever.
Yeah, and to this day, they still haven't been charged or have any accountability.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, Pam, thank you for joining us on The Bad Nurse.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us as well. You can catch this episode and any other on the YouTube channel, Gulf Coast Confidential. I'm your host, writer, and producer, Mollye Barrows, with co-host and researcher Pam Hill. And a big thanks, as always, to director, editor, and production engineer James Roy. You can also listen wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. We'll see you next time.